A.S.D.F. threatens Netanyahu, demands Israel make peace or face isolation. When Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visits the White House tomorrow, President Barack Obama will tell him that his country could face a bleak future, one of international isolation and demographic disaster, if he refuses to endorse a U.S.-drafted framework agreement for peace with the Palestinians. Obama will warn Netanyahu that time is running out for Israel as a Jewish-majority democracy. And the president will make the case that Netanyahu, alone among Israelis, has the strength and political credibility to lead his people away from the precipice. In the Oval Office, Obama, borrowing from the Jewish sage Rabbi Hillel, told me that his message to Netanyahu will be this: if not now, when? And if not you, Mr. Prime Minister, then who? He then took a sharper tone, saying that if Netanyahu does not believe that a peace deal with the Palestinians is the right thing to do for Israel, then he needs to articulate an alternative approach. He added, it's hard to come up with one that's plausible. Unlike Netanyahu, Obama will not address the annual convention of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, a pro-Israel lobbying group. This week, the administration is upset with AIPAC for, in its view, trying to subvert American-led nuclear negotiations. In our interview, the president, while broadly supportive of Israel and a close U.S.-Israel relationship, made statements that would be met at an AIPAC convention with cold silence. Obama was blunter about Israel's future than I've ever heard him. His language was striking, but of a piece with observations made in recent months by his Secretary of State, John Kerry, who until this interview, had taken the lead in pressuring both Netanyahu and the Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, to agree to a framework deal. Obama made it clear that he views Abbas as the most politically moderate leader the Palestinians may ever have. It seemed obvious to me that the president believes that the next move is Netanyahu's. There comes a point where you can't manage this anymore, and then you start having to make very difficult choices, Obama said. Do you resign yourself to what amounts to a permanent occupation of the West Bank? Is that the character of Israel as a state for a long period of time? Do you perpetuate, over the course of a decade or 2 decades, more and more restrictive policies in terms of Palestinian movement? Do you place restrictions on? During the interview, which took place a day before the Russian military incursion into Ukraine, Obama argued that American adversaries, such as Iran, Syria and Russia itself, still believe that he is capable of using force to advance American interests, despite his reluctance to strike Syria last year after President Bashar al-Assad crossed Obama's chemical weapons red line. We've now seen 15 to 20% of those chemical weapons on their way out of Syria with a very concrete schedule to get rid of the rest, Obama told me. That would not have happened had the Iranians, of course they took it seriously. That's why they engaged in the policy they did. I returned to this particularly sensitive subject. Just to be clear, I asked, you don't believe the Iranian leadership now thinks that your all options are on the table threat as it relates to their nuclear program? You don't think that they have stopped taking that seriously? Obama answered, I know they take it seriously. How do you know? I asked. We have a high degree of confidence that when they look at 35,000 U.S. military personnel in the region that are engaged in constant training exercises under the direction of a president who already has shown himself willing to take military action in the past, that they should take my statements seriously, he replied. And the American people should as well, and the Israelis should as well, and the Saudis should as well. I asked the president if, in retrospect, he should have provided more help to Syria's rebels earlier in their struggle. I think those who believe that 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, there was some swift resolution to this thing had we acted more forcefully, fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the conflict in Syria and the conditions on the ground there, Obama said. When you have a professional army that is well armed and sponsored by 2 large states who have huge stakes in this, and they are fighting against a farmer, a carpenter, an engineer who started out as protesters and suddenly now see themselves in the midst of a civil conflict, the notion that we could have, in a clean way that didn't commit U.S. military forces, changed the equation on the ground there was never true. He portrayed his reluctance to involve the U.S. in the Syrian civil war as a direct consequence of what he sees as America's overly militarized engagement in the Muslim congressional effort. There was the possibility that delayed sanctions on Iran just rather than nuclear negotiations were precisely because of never been a negotiation which would have meant that we would have had some pause or some mechanism to indicate possible fourth war in a Muslim country in the span of a decade. You sit down, you have a conversation. If the conversation doesn't go well, you leave the room and everybody knows what's going to happen and everybody gets ready. But you don't start shooting in the middle of the room during the course of negotiations. He said he remains committed to keeping Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons and seemed unworried by reports that Iran's economy is improving. On the subject of Middle East peace, Obama told me that the US's friendship with Israel is undying, but he also issued what I took to be a veiled threat. The U.S., though willing to defend an isolated Israel at the United Nations and in other international bodies, might soon be unable to do so effectively. If you see no peace deal and continued aggressive settlement construction, and we have seen more aggressive settlement construction over the last couple of years than we've seen in a very long time, Obama said. If Palestinians come to believe that the possibility of a contiguous sovereign Palestinian state is no longer within reach, then our ability to manage the international fallout is going to be limited. We also spent a good deal of time talking about the unease the US's Sunni Arab allies feel about his approach to Iran, their traditional adversary. I asked the president, what is more dangerous, Sunni extremism or Shia extremism? I found his answer revelatory. He did not address the issue of Sunni extremism. Instead he argued in essence that the Shiite Iranian regime is susceptible to logic appeals to self-interest and extremism generally, Obama said. I don't think you'll get me to choose on those two issues. What I'll say is that if you look at Iranian behavior, they are strategic, and they're not impulsive. They have a worldview, and they see their interests, and they respond to costs and benefits. And that isn't to say that they aren't a theocracy that embraces all kinds of ideas that I find abhorrent, but they're not North Korea. They are a large, powerful country that sees itself as an important player on the world stage, and I do not think has a suicide wish, and can respond to incentives. This view puts him at odds with Netanyahu's understanding of Iran. In an interview after he won the premiership, the Israeli leader described the Iranian leadership to me as a messianic apocalyptic cult. I asked Obama if he understood why his policies make the leaders of Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries nervous. I think that there are shifts that are taking place in the region that have caught a lot of them off guard, he said. I think change is always scary. Source Bloomberg.